Housing costs are one of the top concerns for Utah voters, and at times this issue can feel intractable. But what if there was a way to solve it that was actually easier than we think?
Housing policy is unique in that, one, it's the number one budget item for your typical family, and two, it's actually a budget item that local and state policy has a huge impact on.
On this episode, we sit down with a national housing expert who argues that the way to fix high housing costs is to change how we think about zoning. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about housing, one of the most pressing policy issues facing people in Utah and around the nation, especially as we've seen in recent years, demand for housing increase, and a lot of reports of people struggling to find housing that fits their budgetary needs. I'm very excited about our guest this week. His name is Nolan Gray. He's the research director for a group called California YIMBY. He's also been a researcher and research fellow on housing and land use issues for a couple different organizations, and notably, he used to be a city planner for New York City. So he has some real on-the-ground experience on these kinds of issues. And of course, he's the author of a book called Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Nolan, thanks so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's a real pleasure to be chatting with you.
I'm excited to sort of help bring your experience and your insights into the Utah conversation. Going through your book, Arbitrary Lines, it was incredibly fascinating to read just because this issue has been so salient here in Utah for a number of years now. And I think most of us, listening or watching this issue have had some kind of direct experience with trying to find a home in our state and facing prices that seemed just simply too high for a lot of folks. So it's one of those unique instances where a policy issue really hits home with a lot of people. And in particular, I want to start off by mentioning some survey research data from Sutherland Institute that we conducted at the beginning of this year in 2024 to ask Utahns what were the issues that were top of their mind when it came to what the legislature was considering. And without question, housing affordability was the top issue among Utah likely voters. And we'll link to this issue brief just so folks have it again. But even when you break down by age, by family structure, by political party, by gender, the various ways that we looked at slicing up the data, housing affordability still ranks up there as such an important issue for Utah likely voters. So it's one of those pressing things that I think, frankly, we probably have to be willing to think outside the box, to think, what can we do to fix this? And so really, I want to start off, Nolan, by asking you, in your view, what do you think the biggest problem is that's leading to affordable housing challenges? If you were to pinpoint one thing, what's the one variable that has the most negative impact on housing prices today?
Well, you raise a lot of really good points. I mean, this is increasingly the top issue. I know that we, certainly with national politics, we get pulled into so many issues where the average person really has very little say or control. But housing policy is unique in that, one, it's the number one budget item for your typical family. And two, it's actually a budget item that local and state policy has a huge impact on. And so in my book, Arbitrary Lines, I make the case that zoning is a big contributor to a lot of the challenges that our communities face. You have zoning rules, for example, that in many cases make housing altogether illegal to build. Where the zoning doesn't make housing illegal to build, it subjects it to additional discretionary standards that have nothing to do with health and safety, but do serve to increase the price of housing. And then even if housing's legal to build and there are a whole bunch of costly mandates or those costly mandates pencil, we subject so much housing production to this long, costly, discretionary, unpredictable, often highly litigious approval process. And so we look at the scope of how we regulate what gets built where and how quickly, and we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we not have a housing crisis? And one of the exciting things that's happening in recent years is that a number of state and local policymakers have said, hey, a lot of this crisis is actually down to policies that we can and should adjust.
So I mean, the focus on zoning, one of the things I've heard so often in recent years on this conversation or on this topic is that fundamentally, and you talk about this in your book as well, fundamentally this comes down to a supply and demand problem. There are simply too many people wanting or needing housing and too few housing units on the market. And the argument goes that, well, one of the biggest constraints of that, perhaps the biggest constraint, is available land, which is affected by zoning. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on why zoning in particular. There are other forms of regulatory components that people have cited, whether it's environmental needs or various regulations put on housing. Impact fees has been another big topic as well, when municipalities levy impact fees on new developments. So I guess what I'm asking is, there are probably a number of different sort of regulatory buckets you could look at. Why does zoning sort of rise to the top as one of, if not the most important one that we would need to be talking about?
Well, so for those who don't know, for those who live happy, normal lives and they don't spend a lot of time thinking about zoning, one, you're still free to keep your innocence and tune off. With apologies to the host. That's a great sell for listeners, right? You should tune out. No, this is the policy that determines what can be built where. It's almost sort of a holdover, almost Soviet style policy that's still in effect in every community today, which is for every single parcel in the city, your government is telling you, this is exactly what you can build and how much of it you can build. So in the vast majority of a typical American city, the only thing that's legal to build in most residential areas is a detached single-family home. Now, many families, that might be exactly what they're looking for. That's what I grew up in. I certainly could see living in a single-family home at some point. But as land prices have increased, and certainly in the Mountain West, as we've bumped up against federal lands, sometimes actually rooted in environmental conservation or risk considerations, sometimes arbitrarily taken off limits, what we're finding is that land values have increased. You're in a situation where a starter home in 2024 is going to look like a townhouse. It's going to look like a small lot, single family home, maybe a home on a 1,400 to 2,500 square foot lot, or it's going to look like a 2 or 3 bedroom condo. Those are the inherently affordable forms of homeownership that get people on this wealth building ladder that we essentially, by a matter of law, do not allow to be built, right? So when we have these laws that restrict the vast majority of our infill areas, sometimes we only allow detached single-family homes on larger lots. Many portions of our cities, the only thing you can build is commercial. We're dealing with this situation where the market literally cannot do what the market does in almost every other sector of the economy and respond to demand with additional supply. And so what we get is a one-way ratchet toward a deepening and deepening crisis. And, it's been refreshing over the last few years. Before COVID, I think this was a little bit more of an abstract issue in many parts of the country. I'm from Kentucky, for example. Housing affordability is a problem in the Northeast and California. But over the course of pandemic, where you had this huge surge in demand, we realized, oh, wow, actually, we are not in a position where markets are able to meet this demand. And it's not just a coastal problem, it's a nationwide problem. And so, I would say, when I give talks in places like Utah, I say, hey, if you don't want to turn into California, if you want to turn into California, just don't do anything, right? You are every state in the country is on that trajectory because the rules we have on the books make it impossible for the market to supply the housing we need. But if you don't want to end up like California, now is the time to remove these regulatory barriers to allow free markets to actually meet the demand of housing consumers and to expand property rights, expand the rights of people to do what they like with their property, and the market will kick in and solve this problem.
Nolan, there's one thing I want to tease out that I think would presumably resonate with a lot of folks here in Utah. We're a very pro-free enterprise state. We love the free market. We love businesses being able to innovate and provide goods and services. And I think in general we do pretty well here at that here in Utah. It sounds like you would essentially say, well, we need to put this through the lens of the question of free enterprises. Is the housing market able to function like a true free market, or maybe at least a truer form of a free market, that we want things to function in terms of this open free enterprise system where the private providers, in this case housing developers, builders, and so on, are able to provide the goods and services that meet the market demand. Is it right to say that maybe one overarching principle is, because of, in your view, because of the types of zoning laws we have on the books, that is constraining the housing market from doing what otherwise a free enterprise system should allow it to do?
Let me put it to you this way, Nick. Imagine if we regulated food the way we regulate housing. Every single local government would have its own rules for what type of food you can grow and produce. They would have rules about what type of food you can sell. They would have rules about how much of any given type of food you can sell. Rules about how much any given farmer could grow on his or her land, produce in his or her home. Imagine what would happen if that was the way we governed food. Of course, we would have a famine, right? It would be a complete mess, as with almost every other form a sector of the economy where we applied this type of top-down micromanaging of the economy. And yet we do this with housing, and we're surprised that we have a severe housing shortage where many hundreds of thousands of families are losing their path to homeownership. Folks are stuck renting, and they're spending, in many cases, a third to half of their income on rent. Historically, it was considered to be normal to spend about a quarter of your income on rent. And then, of course, we have mounting homelessness crises. And of course, some of the homelessness crisis is about mental health and substance abuse, but many people who are homeless are sleeping in cars or sleeping on couches, and they're holding down jobs, and they actually just need an affordable home. So, I would say to folks, this is actually a highly solvable problem, and in many cases from more free market conservative principles, is restore property rights, allow the market to provide the housing that there's so much unmet demand for. And we are making progress on this in some places, and it's a funny thing. Sometimes progressives embrace it, sometimes conservatives embrace it. One of the beautiful things about this issue is it actually ends up being somewhat bipartisan, cross-ideological. There's a great quote, right? There's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up trash. I would contend that there's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up or to reckon with the fact that we have a housing shortage. We need to build more housing. We have to reckon with the rules that are blocking that from happening.
Well, the idea of this being bipartisan is, I think, another thing that will resonate with folks, because I think people are, and myself included, largely so just tired of what feels like endless partisan bickering, and that feeds into this culture of contempt and polarization that we have across political lines. And anytime we can find a policy issue that can sort of bypass that, or at least bring people together around some common ground ideas, is a really encouraging thing. So I want to underscore that for our listeners. Nolan, I want to ask you, if you were talking directly to municipal leaders, so city council members, mayors, planning commissioners, because it seems like a lot of this, is kind of focused on those types of folks just because of the zoning decisions that happen at that level. What would you say to them if they said, well, look, Nolan, I'm a city council member or a planning commissioner at this city, and, I care about making sure we have housing that people need. I also love my city, and I want it to be the kind of place that our residents continue to love and want to live in. What do you tell them? What do you think city leaders need to be doing differently today?
It's a great question. The way we approach new development today is we have rules on the books that make it hard to build almost anything. So new developments have to have some sort of discretionary relief, like a rezoning, special permit, variance. That has to go to city council. Our public process for that is a Tuesday 10 a.m. public hearing where a very unrepresentative cross-section of the community shows up and has to take turns yelling for 2 or 3 minutes. Then we have a big vote and everybody's unhappy, right? We need to fundamentally rethink how we approach these problems. And I think first thing we can do is go out and understand what the consensus for growth is going to look like. Go out and talk to the different stakeholders, talk to the folks who build housing, try to get normal people in the community, get their perspectives on these issues. In many cases, when you move from this reactive project by project public hearing approach to development to a broad, hey, let's come up with a big picture plan. Let's figure out what type of growth we need to have to remain affordable in the long term. What does that growth look like in a way that actually is market feasible and will, satisfy, I think, the preferences of local residents? And then if a project comes in and it complies with the rules, it should be approved. So in terms of figuring out, once you've kind of done a little bit of that groundwork of going out and building that coalition around pro-growth and pro-abundant housing, a couple places to look for reform. Where are you constantly receiving discretionary relief applications? So in many urban communities, for example, minimum parking requirements are quite high. They require tons and tons of parking to be built that the consumers of those properties do not otherwise demand. And so developers are constantly forced to request relief from these parking mandates. If you're getting lots of variances like that, that's a market signal of, hey, that's a binding constraint that's increasing housing costs. You could probably lower those mandates tomorrow and immediately start getting more infill housing built at more affordable price points. In a suburban or a rural context, it might be looking at things like minimum lot sizes. So minimum lot size rules, we say, hey, if a consumer can't afford at least a certain amount of land, they're not allowed to have a home here, right? So this can say, if you don't have a lot of 10,000 square feet, 15,000 square feet, a half acre, you're not allowed to have a home. Now, in contexts where there's no water and sewer installed, that might actually serve a health and safety function. But in your typical urban or suburban context, it serves no function except to increase the price of housing. And so in many places, we force developers who want to build inherently more affordable homes to go through a much more difficult process. Whereas if they want to build larger, more expensive homes, we make it relatively easy. I would say we need to have an open market for these things, allow for a range of different housing typologies, and allow market actors who actually have skin in the game to go out and figure out what type of housing makes sense to build, rather than having it be governed through planning dictates. Allow for flexibility. This is a key thing. I think some people approach these issues, and people who like to live in cities beat up on suburbs, and people who like to live in suburbs beat up on cities. To me, a healthy metropolis, a healthy state, has a range of housing typologies that meet a range of needs for a range of different types of households at different points in their life. That means apartments within walking distance of maybe schools or parks or corner groceries for some folks. That means single family homes with a 2-car garage and a nice yard for other folks. We don't have to be in the scarcity mindset of the government determining what types of housing can and can't be built. We can actually create a framework where everyone's housing needs can be met. And moving beyond that scarcity mindset that we're stuck in, that we've fallen into in places like California, is really key.
So, no, Nolan, I want to pinpoint something right there, because you touch on this idea of there are different environments that people want. Maybe they have different preferences or even different times in their life. And not just in my own life, my wife and I, but before we got married, when we were both still single, living in, say, downtown Salt Lake City is a much different experience, just from my point of view, if you're a single working professional, than if you're married with kids. And now we're married, we have a couple kids, and so being kind of farther out in the suburbs makes a lot more sense to us. We prefer that. And so I guess my question to you is, and under the kinds of things that you would love to see happen, is it safe to say that it doesn't mean that everything is going to become one thing? So it's not like everything in terms of our housing stock is going to be exactly like downtown Salt Lake City. It also means that we can't have rules that mandate that everything has to look like the suburbs of Eagle Mountain or Draper or other places that are kind of farther outside just the urban core in the Salt Lake area. Is it just that, well, those things should still exist? You should still have this diversity of housing types, and if you want a single-family home with some yard space and you use a car to get around, that should still be available to folks. But is it just the basic principle of market forces should help determine that more so than government mandates or restrictions through the form of zoning? Is that the right way to sort of extrapolate the broad principle?
Absolutely. I'll belabor the metaphor a little bit more of what if we regulated housing like food? The government was determining what could be grown or manufactured. You would go into the supermarket and you would have maybe 2 or 3 options, and if you didn't like them, tough, right? Instead, we live in a free market system for food. You walk into a Ralph's or a Whole Foods or a Vaughn's or whatever it might be near you, and you have hundreds, thousands of different options. There's many foods in any given supermarket that I don't want to eat. There's many foods that you don't want to eat. On some days, I want orange chicken. On other days, I might want the Mandarin chicken if we're at Trader Joe's, right? But the beautiful thing about allowing for a market and allowing for a system where the government isn't rigidly saying, here is the type of product that we're going to allow, and if you don't like it, tough. The beautiful thing is that you get choice that satiates people's different demands. And you look at cities and suburbs all across the country, and this is as true in California as it is in Utah, as it is in Kentucky, as it is in Texas, as it is in New York. In so many of our communities, the government say, well, there's only a certain type of housing we're going to allow. It's going to have all of these mandated amenities that you might or might not prefer to pay for. We're not going to give you any choice. And so, to my mind, this is how I approach this issue, is expanding the choice and the options for people. Exactly to your point, even for an individual person, at different stages in your life, you need different types of housing. And in many communities, for example, we have a shortage of student housing, and that might be 2 or 3 bedrooms, 2 bed, 2 bath, 3 bed, 3 bath. We have a shortage of family-sized units. We have shortages of homes that are well suited to maybe retired empty nesters who might want a smaller unit that's within walking or transit distance of daily needs and necessities. Flip side is we need more single family homes that have yards and access to great schools. So, again, I would say, when we fall into this trap of, well, we have to have a big public debate over what are the 2 or 3 types of food we're going to sell at the supermarket, that's the wrong frame. The frame has to be, how do we allow for as many different options in housing as possible?
Well, when you talk about changes to zoning, and even I think at times in your book and in other writings, even the term, abolishing zoning, you speak pretty directly about the paradigm of zoning laws we have on the books in cities throughout the country today are something that you're pretty critical of in your writing. And I want to ask, again, assuming you're talking to, I would say either a city leader, again, a mayor, planning commissioner, city council member, or even a state legislator, and they're thinking, how do we fix this, Nolan? And if you're making this argument about zoning, should they then interpret that we just need to have zero zoning at all on any level municipally, or is it, well, you can still have some kind of zoning guideline, but it has to be significantly changed from what it is right now? How would you characterize that?
It's a great question. For the typical city, they can resolve this crisis in the near term by reform. And I think that's where we are now, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? Get rid of your costly mandates, expand the range of housing options that can be built, allow for more inherently affordable, naturally occurring market rate, affordable housing to be built, and you can mostly solve your problem, right? I mean, this is in certain housing abundant contexts where, housing has remained relatively affordable, places like Texas, to a certain extent, other portions of the Sun Belt, they've achieved it even with something kind of sort of like zoning. And it's because the zoning is still flexible enough and the permitting processes are still speedy and predictable enough that it's not a big barrier. That said, in my book, I do argue that I think we need a bigger picture rethink of what we want out of land use planning. So as I've said, the way we do things today is every so many years, in some cases it might take decades before we refresh these codes, the government comes in and says, here's the permitted use and the permitted density on every single lot. And, I think there are wise reasons why we do some form of land use planning, but I think this is an overly broad attempt to address this issue. In the book, I say, hey, what do we actually want out of land use planning? I think two things. One is we want to make sure that new uses are not imposing a cost on their neighbors. So, sometimes this is classic nuisances like noise or smell or runoff. You got to have regulations for that. No question, right? Ideally, you're not in a situation where every single case of a violation has to be litigated. There needs to be some enforcement. Perfectly reasonable. Then there are other things that aren't necessarily classic nuisances, but can affect people's quality of life, things like traffic and parking. And same thing. I mean, the way we solve these issues is by saying, well, we're going to solve the issue of traffic by simply just not allowing any new housing to be built. And I would argue there are smarter ways to address traffic, provide a range of a range of transportation options on some super congested freeways, exploring traffic demand management strategies. There are smarter ways to do it. It's not to say that we don't have any prudent regulation to protect people, but the way we do it today, I think, doesn't make sense. The second reason why we have land use regulation is we want to make sure that growth is coordinated with new infrastructure. But the topsy-turvy way that we've solved this problem in many U.S. cities is we say, well, if the infrastructure is not there, you're just not allowed to build. Whereas I think the way we should approach it is, well, okay, the growth is coming, and so let's have a plan to actually provide the infrastructure needed to accommodate it. I think it's fair to say, hey, the new development should internalize some of those costs. It shouldn't totally be borne on the broader community. But you can actually have a long-term smart plan for the infrastructure that's going to be necessary. So many communities, I think they look at their options and they say, well, our options are we allow a whole bunch of new development and our community changes, or our other option is we don't allow any new development and our community stays exactly the same way it is today. And I would say that's not actually the option facing most communities. The options are you either change in terms of the built environment, you build more housing to meet demand, housing remains relatively affordable, the folks who are born and raised in a community can stay, the folks who want to move to that community for opportunity or personal reasons can move there. Or you don't do any building, and the community changes radically in terms of demographics. The folks who are born there can't afford to stay there. They have to move away, right? So many Californians have been priced out, and they've moved to places like Utah, exporting our housing crisis. And we're increasingly in a situation where, Utah's in the same position, where folks who grew up in a place like Utah are now having to look far afield and move far away to find affordable housing. You're in a situation where the folks who serve you at the hospital or at the grocery store or in a restaurant can't afford to have decent, stable housing. And that's the option where, okay, you didn't allow any new building. In a superficial sense, your community didn't change. But in every meaningful sense that matters, the actual community, the people that make up your neighborhood have changed radically. That's the option facing communities across the country. And I would say, coming up with a plan for growth, coming up with prudent rules that address people's real concerns, coming up with a long-term plan to build infrastructure in a way that's fiscally and environmentally sustainable, that's the path we have to take.
You've mentioned a couple times this idea of what I would interpret as essentially more work on the front end as far as at the city level to look at kind of these master plans. You mentioned sometimes they're not updated maybe as often as sounds like they should be. And I want to dial into that for a minute. This will feel maybe a little bit wonky for some of our listeners, but your experience, of course, working as a city planner in the past for New York City gives you a really unique insight into this issue. In my background, I was a policy advisor at the Salt Lake County Council where we dealt with some of these housing and development issues, not anywhere at the same level that you did in your role, but I'm recalling back some of the conversations and debates we had at the county level, just because Salt Lake County oversees some of the development for parts of the valley that are not incorporated as cities. So we still had these, planning requests come before us from time to time, at times creating controversy for all the reasons we're talking about right now. But kind of thinking through that lens, again, thinking as a city planner, a city mayor, a county official, it sounds to me like you're saying that, well, what we should be doing at the municipal level is putting more work in upfront and proactively when you're making your master plans, that essentially that's where the work happens to build out your master plan, to create a true long-term vision of how you want your city to grow, and more importantly, to accommodate the growth that is coming, especially in a place like Utah where we have such high population growth, both organically from folks having kids and immigration. It's just a reality that we're facing right now. But is it safe to say that if we collectively did better on the front end and creating those plans with the level of detail or maybe the level of flexibility that need to be in there, can you then preempt having to have, every time a new application comes, it becomes a big fight over a specific development? When someone says, well, I want to build a few housing units, whatever the number is, it becomes a huge fight. You can preempt some of that by doing a little bit more work on the front end. Is that the right kind of characterization of that component of what you're proposing?
I think that's exactly right, Nick. I have a friend who's on a planning commission here in Southern California, and he introduced a resolution to change the name of it to the Reacting Commission. Right? Because the way we do this so much today is we just sit around and wait for an application to come in, and then we have a big fight over it, and then we scramble to figure out, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the public funds? Yada, yada, yada. What are the rules we're going to impose? Exactly to your point. I think there's a superficial read of this book that, it's all anti-planning. I actually think that there's an area where planning can create real value, and it's exactly in the way that you say, which is sit down, have a realistic conversation about the growth that's expected to be coming. Think about the investments that need to be made to accommodate that growth and how you're going to finance them in an equitable and sustainable way. Come up with the rules that are necessary to make sure that everybody's bought in and that growth enriches the quality of life of current residents rather than dilutes it. And then when projects come in that comport with that vision, approve them relatively promptly and easily. That, I would say, is planning at its best. And, it's funny, the topsy-turvy situation we're in so many U.S. cities, we micromanage what happens on private land. If you own a home and you want to add an accessory dwelling unit to your backyard or convert your basement or your attic into a secondary unit, maybe for an aging parent or a young adult child who can't afford a home anymore in your community, we micromanage that. We are incredibly detailed with the rules. There are going to be fees. There's going to be design rules, et cetera, et cetera. Then meanwhile, your typical U.S. city doesn't actually even have a long-term plan for the street grid as the city grows out, where the park's going to be, where the school's going to be. It's a very ad hoc reactive process. And, you look back at the way we used to do planning, including in places like Utah, which has a very robust and fascinating city planning tradition. And we would say, hey, let's sit down and come up with a plan. Here's the street grid. Here's roughly how much it's going to cost to build this out. Here's how we're going to pay for it. Some of it's going to come from the new development. Some of it's going to come from the entire community. Here's where the parks are going to go. Here's where the schools are going to go. We're going to make sure everybody's within walking distance of nice basic amenities. But then what you do on your private land, we mostly leave it up to you as long as you're not causing a nuisance for your neighbors. That, to my mind, is planning. And that's exactly the type of work that's the type of planning work where what planners are doing is they're maximizing the right of every individual and every family to actually plan their own lives. They're creating a framework in which we have a lot more individual plans that can be realized rather than this one vision where we say, well, okay, we don't really know what's going to happen with the public realm, with the fundamentals of quality of life with urban planning, but we are going to tell you exactly what you can and can't build on your property, what type of business you can and can't start, how many parking spaces you have to have, how large your lots have to be. I would flip it and get back to that earlier, I think, beautiful tradition.
So under that kind of paradigm that you're suggesting, to draw back to a specific example, again, I mentioned some of the past debates we've had on these issues here in Utah, and a number of years ago there was a big fight over a proposed development called Olympia Hills that was in the southwest corner of Salt Lake Valley. Some of our residents may remember that, and that was at the time when I was working at Salt Lake County Council as an advisor. And I just mentioned that just as an example of the kinds of big fights we have, because there was a big plot of land that wasn't developed, that they wanted to develop into a large housing development that would have, I think if memory serves, it would have some mixed housing types, have some other uses as well, somewhat similar to the Daybreak community in South Jordan, Utah, if you're familiar with that. And of course, a lot of our listeners will be as well. Anyway, so that was the proposal, but it, of course, became a big fight. And one of the things I remember in particular from that, and this has come up in a number of contexts on this issue, is in some of the conversations I had and concerns I heard from residents of these cities, at times I was actually surprised that there wasn't as much of a NIMBY, this not in my backyard mentality, as I think sometimes is a stereotype, but it was this attitude of look, I know we need more housing in Utah, I'm open to that, but the transportation infrastructure cannot accommodate the people we have living here now. It takes me forever just to get home to my house during rush hour. The traffic is really bad, and I'm just worried that this will make it 10 times worse. I mean, it's something like that. These are the kinds of concerns that people are facing. And one of the things I heard was if they had a guarantee or as close to a guarantee as possible that the transportation infrastructure could accommodate the growth, that a lot of their concerns would be alleviated. And I know that can touch on other areas of infrastructure as well. But I'm wondering how would you suggest leaders here in Utah approach, because obviously there's a balancing, right? There's the need for more housing and the opportunity to build more housing on land or maybe redevelopment areas where we can do that. But when there can be some of these negative externalities on transportation or other infrastructure needs, how can we balance those things in the context of that kind of broad planning vision you just laid out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I say, of course, NIMBYism is a big challenge in a lot of our communities, but I think you make a fair point. I mean, sure, you're going to have the people who they just don't want their community to change at all, can't really work with that. You have the people who, well, I don't want anyone lower income or who doesn't look like me living near me, can't really do anything about that. But you do have a lot of people who say, yeah, hey, look, I'm just concerned about the traffic. I'm concerned about some other completely valid quality of life concern. I think policymakers should take that seriously. And to the extent possible, either have a long-term plan to provide the infrastructure that's needed to accommodate that growth, be undertaking some measures to try to manage demand, so alternatives to, for example, needing to sit on the freeway. Or I think one underutilized opportunity is building more housing in places where there's already infrastructure that's potentially underutilized. So in a lot of our historic closer in cities and even inner suburbs, what we've seen is because household sizes have fallen, in many cases, the infrastructure is actually pretty significantly overbuilt. In a lot of those communities, you could take maybe a single family home and put 2 or 3 townhouses or small lot single family homes, or you could take a small commercial lot and turn it into a cottage court. And you wouldn't actually need to do these big, costly, expensive infrastructure upgrades. And that might be in a context where the person living there might be able to take a commute on a bus or be able to walk or ride a bike or have at least a shorter commute that's not putting so much of a burden on our freeways. And so this type of infill housing, of course, a healthy city is growing up and it's growing out. Growing out is more complicated. It's going to involve new infrastructure, but there's also a highly unrealized opportunity in many cities, which is allowing for more infill, allowing for projects that take that tired old strip mall that's half empty in an age of Amazon, or that old office park that nobody's returning to in a time of remote work, and you can take these sites and say, hey, the infrastructure is already there. We're just not we legally do not allow redevelopment of the site. That's some of the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. And in many cases, you work with your local developers, your local mission-driven builders, the folks who are invested in your community in the long term, and you ask them, hey, what can we do with this site? And they will give you clear, workable answers that will get housing built tomorrow.
Nolan, one of the things I want to ask, I mean, the conversation around zoning and how to reform it, how to change it, again, is a fascinating one that I think I encourage everyone to go read your book. Even as I was going through, there were times where I read something like, I'm not sure what I think about that yet, but it made me think. And I think the important takeaway is that this is a crisis level issue here in Utah. This has been something that our governor, Spencer Cox, has said this is his top priority. And he said multiple times that this is, I think he's used the word existential as far as Utah, where there are people today who think, well, I love Utah. I don't know if I can stay here because of the housing costs. So it's a very real thing that I think should force us to think outside the box a little bit and have these kinds of conversations. So for that, I commend the work that you're doing to help us have these kinds of discussions that are needed. I want to ask, in the context of Utah specifically, is there anything unique to Utah that you've observed in your research on this issue? As you've looked at cities around the nation, a lot of your references are kind of the big, well-known cities. New York, of course, where you worked, Southern California. You talk about San Jose, California a lot in your book as well, and some of the other big focal points when we look nationally at housing policy. But what about Utah? In some ways, we are unique. Our geography limits the amount of housing we can build just in terms of the land constraints because we have so many mountains. Our major urban core butts up right against the Wasatch Front. So, I mean, those are just a couple of things. But what stands out to you what makes Utah different? And maybe is there anything that makes Utah different in a positive way that means we have an opportunity to really be innovative and solve this problem? What stands out to you?
Well, as a Californian, I wouldn't presume to come into Utah with all the answers, but I will say a couple things. I think a couple strengths that create challenges in their own way. Utah is a naturally very beautiful state with a lot of strong communities and a healthy, growing economy. Folks who are from Utah are going to want to stay there, and a lot of folks from the rest of the country are discovering this is a place where I would like to settle down. That's a very good problem to have, right? A much harder problem to have is folks are saying, well, there's no jobs here, there's no natural amenities, the community is falling apart, we're moving away. That, as hard as growth is, decline is much harder. So, I would say start by counting your blessings and saying, how do we appreciate this incredible opportunity we have and leverage it to build long-term healthy communities? And that the first thing is recognizing it's going to involve change. It's going to involve growth that will involve communities changing in ideally small and incremental ways, but in ways that, might disrupt a traditional idea of the classic everyone living in a detached single-family home in a two-car garage on the periphery of the city. I would say a challenge that's true of Utah and in many states in the Mountain West is there's the Wasatch Front. There are natural barriers on many part of the Salt Lake metro area. So of course, the city can still grow out in some ways, but as you sort of push against those natural limits, there's going to be more pressure to be able to find ways to grow up. And ideally, that conversation happens before we completely run out of all that land. Now, some of that barrier also, this is also true across the Mountain West, is federal land. And of course, in some cases, it'll make sense for the federal government to release more of that land, certainly where there's no outstanding conservation value or natural hazard. Now, of course, in California, as in Utah, wildfires in the wildlife-urban interface are a growing issue. And so we have to be careful about putting all of our eggs in that basket of saying, well, we're going to solve all of our housing affordability problems exclusively by building out. So again, all of this returns to we have to adopt rules that allow for flexibility, that allow for our cities to grow up and out. Salt Lake is also unique in that it's defined by one major metro area, and it's one very heavily fragmented metro area. So a unique feature of the way we do zoning and land use regulation in the U.S. is that it's almost entirely a local power. States delegate this power to local governments, and every local government has the right to decide how many jobs they're going to permit or how many housing units they're going to permit. The problem is that housing markets don't stop and start at municipal boundaries. Job markets don't stop and start at municipal boundaries. And if we don't take a metropolitan or a regional, or in the case of Utah, a statewide approach, then we're not going to meaningfully solve this issue. And so, this is a reason why in many parts of the Mountain West, including places like Montana and Arizona, a lot of these conversations are happening by necessity at the state level. And that's not to say that the state is taking all or even most of the power here away from local governments, but that is saying the state government coming in and saying, hey, we're going to establish some basic guardrails. We're going to take steps to make sure that every local government's at least allowing the market to accommodate its fair share of housing. And we're going to clamp down on the most extreme abuses of some of these powers. One of the most successful things that we've done here in California has been, as I was mentioning previously, a statewide framework for accessory dwelling units, allowing every homeowner to build a second unit on his or her property subject to a clear, workable statewide standard. And so what that gets you, of course, that gets you a lot of units. We've had almost 100,000 ADUs permitted over the last 6 or 7 years. But that statewide market gets you economies of scale where you can actually have small local builders who say, wow, I can build an ADU subject to broadly the same rules in any part of the state. And so you get a real economy that can build these things efficiently. In places like Montana and Arizona, they've said, we're going to take steps to make sure that everywhere in the state, if you've got a commercial zone, you can also build residential. So you can take maybe that old strip mall and turn it into an apartment building with ground floor shops, the type of housing that we need as household sizes shrink. Places like Arizona as well, allowing for inherently affordable smaller homes on smaller lots. Again, local government's still in the driver's seat on a lot of these decisions, and they need a lot of fiscal support from states to do this work, but putting guardrails around this and making sure that everybody's doing their fair share to build housing.
Nolan, you teed up perfectly kind of my next question. In the couple of minutes we have left, I want to ask you about the state-local interplay, because I think often this issue can be framed in terms of a fight between the state leaders, particularly state legislators, and local government officials. And so cities, we talked a lot about planning commissioners, sort of versus the state legislature. And I want to ask you, is there a way to fix this issue that doesn't have to lean into that adversarial kind of push and pull? Obviously, there might be some differing views and people approaching this issue differently, but maybe it's just the Utah in me that I think, well, the Utah way is we all come to the table, we figure out something that we think will work pretty well for everybody, trying to find this consensus approach. Is there a way to do that when looking at the role of the state government versus the role of local governments, where no one's going to feel like they're getting run over, that there's a way to do this where everyone can feel like, yeah, I think I feel good about our approach. It's checking the right boxes and helping us move in the right direction. Is there a way to do that? And if so, how do we do it?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I love that perspective. I think there are some folks who say, look, the state has no business ever doing anything on this issue. It's purely local prerogative. These are usually the local jurisdictions saying this are usually those who are not doing their fair share by allowing the market to build housing. And then you have other folks who say, yeah, the state should be doing everything. We need to have rigid plans. I would say we have to approach a prudent balance here, right? What the state can do, of course, the local governments, the ball is in their court, right? And they need to lead on this issue, and they need to show, hey, we're responsible stewards of the state delegated power. And you do have a lot of local governments. Certainly, I've seen some outstanding examples in Utah and across the country of local governments recognizing, hey, this is a crisis. There's some low-hanging fruit in terms of liberalizing and allowing the market to provide more of this housing, and local governments and local planners and local coalitions leading on this issue. And that's exciting. On the other hand, in many local governments, right, you don't have a lot of movement on this. In many cases, you might have, the same little clique of NIMBYs who show up to oppose everything. And you have local officials who say, well, I want to make progress on this issue. I want to reform on this issue, but the politics just don't work. And they say, it's almost like it would be helpful if the state government came in and put basic standards that nudged local governments to do their fair share. And it's funny, I'll regularly, we'll work on this in California and other states, and, the locals will say, well, we don't want any interventions, but then quietly a few local officials will be like, yeah, I appreciate you actually putting up guardrails and requiring that my local jurisdiction take some action, because otherwise it wasn't going to work. So, state governments, I think, can be helpful here in terms of, one, solving this prisoner's dilemma, right? A metro area like Salt Lake. Salt Lake City proper only covers about 14% to 15% of the population of metropolitan Salt Lake City. So even if the city proper were doing everything right, if many of the other suburbs in the metro area are not adopting liberalizing reforms, it's going to be very hard to solve this crisis. And so the state coming in and I think nudging local governments or providing incentives to local governments to allow their fair share is key. I think another thing is scaling up best practices. So again, the leadership on this issue starts in many cases at the local government, but you have examples where local governments are undertaking outstanding programs that are working really well. And it's perfectly reasonable to say, hey, that's working. Let's scale this up. So, for example, I would return to things like ADUs in California, or if you prefer a red state example, in Florida. They said, okay, in commercial zones all across the state, if you can build workforce housing, local governments, you have to allow a little bit of extra density. You have to allow some extra relief from the height, and we're going to kick in some financial supports to make that work, right? This is happening in blue states and it's happening in red states. I don't think there's a particularly ideological approach to this. And exactly to your point, I think this whole giant framing of the issue as local control versus state intervention, to my mind, this is the wrong frame. The right frame is, how do we get to a more flexible and open framework that's going to get us the housing we need? Sometimes that's going to involve local leadership. Sometimes that's going to involve state guardrails and a little bit of state nudging and state incentives. And when I look out across what's happening across the U.S., I see most of them involve a healthy mix of both.
Well, Nolan, that's about at time. That this is one of those issues that we could talk about for hours, because it's so important for Utahns, and there's so many important policy questions that go into it. My last question for you, I always like to do the elevator question, meaning you find yourself in an elevator with Utah's legislative leadership in one elevator, and the other elevator you have a bunch of city leaders, and somehow you're in two elevators at the same time, but they ask you, hey, you're Nolan Gray, I've got 30 seconds. What's the one thing we should do in Utah right now, in your view? What's the most immediate important step we need to take in terms of housing or zoning reform? What would you say to them? Where's the right place to start?
Legalize housing that's inherently affordable to build and that the market can start building tomorrow. Your ADUs, your small lot single-family homes and townhouses, your apartments along commercial corridors, and near transit. Those are things that in many cases you have great local developers who are eager to build. They're trying to build it, make it as easy as possible for them to build this great product that will keep your communities affordable and provide more opportunity for the next generation of Utahns. This is a tricky issue. In many cases, it seems bleak. We've seen home prices run up to incredible rates. We've seen more and more renters facing rent burdens. We see rising homelessness rates in places that frankly never even had a homelessness crisis. The good news is this is a highly, highly solvable problem with some smart reforms, and state and local policymakers alike can be leaders on this community and leaders on a policy issue where when we achieve reform, people's lives immediately start to improve.
I think we can leave it there, and I'll just say that answer you just gave, I think, gives some hope to folks. I'm even imagining folks who think, well, I want to be able to buy a home sometime soon for my family, and maybe feel worried about that prospect. That I think what you just said hopefully can be a shot of optimism for all of us, that if this issue is solvable and we have some mechanisms to help move the needle starting now, then that should be really encouraging to our listeners out there, that having these kinds of conversations will help the right policy reforms come to pass.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for all the thoughtful questions.
Nolan, thank you for your time. And again, Nolan Gray is our guest. He's the author of the book Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Very fascinating and important read on this issue. I encourage you to go read it and engage in the discussion. This is a big issue here in Utah that we need to fix. And Nolan, again, thank you for your time and your expertise with us on Defending Ideas.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Well, we're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we close the episode, there are two key takeaways that I captured from our conversation with Nolan Gray that I want to emphasize for us that we can use in our conversations about this issue. Number one, we have to recognize in so many ways this really is an existential issue for the state of Utah. High housing costs are top of mind for all of us. It's true in the survey data among Utah likely voters, as we've said before, who rank housing affordability as their top policy concern. Utah Governor Spencer Cox has mentioned on numerous occasions that it's a top priority for his administration. So we have to recognize that this is kind of an all-hands-on-deck issue, that we have to think outside the box if we're going to find real solutions. And maybe that should prompt questions around the things we talked about today with Nolan, about things like zoning reform or changes to how we think about zoning and planning at the local level. And the second point I think that we need to remember is that a guiding principle should be, how can we leverage the free enterprise system to help find solutions rather than working against the free market? Market forces can be incredibly powerful to provide goods and services based on demand in a way that helps people get what they need, providing an affordable product or service that people are trying to get access to. So that bigger question of how can we unleash innovation in the private sector, free enterprise, so that the market can work in a way to better, hopefully, meet the demand for housing here in the state of Utah. I, again, encourage all of you to go out and read the book, Arbitrary Lines. It'll make you think. It'll prompt some questions in your mind that maybe you haven't thought about before in the context of housing policy and zoning. You may not agree with everything in there, but I think it's one of those installments or one of those additions to the public debate around housing issues that can help us have the kinds of conversations that lead to maybe some outside the box or innovative thinking to help us move the needle in a significant way. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. I hope that you've enjoyed what you've heard, and that you feel better equipped to engage on this very important issue of housing policy here in our state. If you liked what you heard and you want to subscribe, please visit defendingideas.org. You can get access to this show in various formats on video. You can go to YouTube and subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel and click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple, all the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and make sure you click that subscribe button. And lastly, if you like this conversation and you want to see more of this kind of content, more discussions like this one, please consider supporting the work of Sutherland Institute broadly and help us have more episodes like this talking about issues that really matter to Utahns. To do that, visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That is all for this episode of Defend Ideas. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.